That to me captures a lot of the evil of this system. And it's starting to register with people with the Epstein things. Like, how can they get away with this? If this, how we tolerate all sorts of political abuses and corruption, but like the trafficking of children to people in high places to blackmail them so that they'll act against the public interest, this is unacceptable. And I think that this sort of gradual understanding, even incomplete as it is, and not with good political analysis, especially when you're talking about the right, this is showing an empire that is facing a legitimacy crisis like it's never faced, at the same time that it's losing its material wherewithal to successfully determine the outcomes of military confrontations. I mean, I think that Israel lost the war with Iran. NATO is losing in Ukraine. A war in Taiwan would be a disaster. I don't think a war in Venezuela. I think a war in Venezuela would be a disaster, although I don't know if it would have success in the short term or not. I mean, we are just the empire in terms of soft power and hard power is in the worst position in my lifetime, really probably in the history of Western civilization, if you consider it, because it's been consolidated under this U.S. leadership. And now this whole project is just so tainted and illegitimate that it can't be defended unless you just ignore enormous amounts of reality. You have to have a made-up version of reality to even argue remotely on behalf of the prevailing order that we live under. Kirk was saying about his woes for the last few months when talking about pro-Israeli donors pulling out of his coalition and so on. He says they act in such a stereotypical fashion, right? Like they act like all the stereotypes. And it's like, but when you think about that, is he accurate about that? And yes, he is. I mean, they literally have like the guy from Minnesota, Norm Coleman, and he was on stage. He's a Zionist Jewish American, and he was saying, "What's going on social media and TikTok? Come on, we own Facebook. We're the masters of the universe. Jews own social media." He says something to that effect, right? Which, if you'd said that, 6 years ago, if you'd said those exact things, you'd be like, "Oh, he had an anti-Semitic meltdown." And people like Larry Ellison are literally rich Jewish Zionists whose approach to the problems with Israel's legitimacy are, I'm just going to use all my money, buy all the media, and manipulate it so that people don't hear bad things, don't hear about the crimes that are being committed, including the mass slaughter of children. That's the heart of it, that this is really more of a top-down, despotic, lawless system designed to reproduce an imperial capitalist empire, an imperial capitalist system that enriches oligarchs beyond all imagining. So the longest serving Republican Speaker of the House in U.S. history, Dennis Hastert, was a high school wrestling coach who was a pedophile. And then he went from there to being a congressman and then the Speaker of the House.
I totally agree with you, Aaron, that I also think we are in one of the darkest civilizations in human history. And whilst we have been taught that we are in the most enlightened civilization in human history. Okay, cool. All right, hello everyone. We are here today again with Aaron Good of the American Exception podcast. Aaron does a lot of very good things on the deep state and US the criminality behind the imperialism that we see. I think it's a very excellent program, and with a lot of excellent guests and good discussions. So I wanted to get you on because we live in a day and age that things are becoming more clearer and clearer, so to speak. Why am I saying this? I think increasingly, I think your work that really focuses on deep state criminality of U.S. empire and our political systems and our economic system, by the way, I increasingly feel that it's super significant. Because your work really explains to me, and I think many other people, why we are in that hellscape that we are in right now. It really goes to the deep systemic rot of our system that just gets a very, very little attention somehow. We are in academia. You don't hear about it in academia. You can put on the news, the mainstream media. You don't hear it there. It's always a surface discussion about everything that's going on. For example, when we ask ourselves who wants all these wars that we see, whether it's Libya, whether it's the genocide in Palestine, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, etc., 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 who want all these wars? If we ask ourselves that question also to our audience, then usually activists will say, well, US empire. Okay, it's a very almost anonymous kind of big ephemeral kind of construct that is very hard to pinpoint. Or people will say Trump or Biden, or people will say big oil, big pharma. But in reality, again, we still have that question: who drive empire? Which people? What CEOs? Which shadowy figures in the CIA? Which drug and people traffickers? Like, who are really the people that want this crap that is just destroying our world? Now, before I rant on for too long, I'm going to ask you a broad question, and I hope you can answer that for our audience. And the question is, for our audience, what is the deep state? And why is it so important to connect it to US imperialism and also what we see right now, Israel? So that's a big and broad question, but I hope you can answer that, Aaron.
I hope that I can answer it, and I hope that I answer it in a way that's succinct enough that the people are able to follow it. Because if you write too much on a subject, you can go on and on about it forever, which I do in different ways. But really, the definition of the deep state is important to try to nail down. And the deep state is, I think of it in broadly speaking, two senses. The first one, which is the bigger overall sort of systemic one, is really something of a question of the regime of the West, of the US. Okay, and the regime, if you look at the word state in political science terms, it's generally, you would think of like Max Weber. I mean, there's a Marxist version of it too, but which is a bit more of a bigger, like, it is the capitalist prevailing order almost. It could be the Marxist version of the state, right? But in political science terms, it comes from Max Weber's idea, which is the state is that organization which maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in a given territory, okay, which is more or less like the government, we can say. Now, the idea of the regime is all of those institutions that determine who has control of the state. So you could have a democratic regime type, you could have a dictatorship, you could have a fascist party rule, you could have all these communist party rule, all these different types of regimes that you could have. We would in the US say we have a democratic regime type. Well, I think that there's enough in the historical record to say that we don't have a democratic regime type. We have something else, but we do have this democratic state with elections and legislative bodies, a judiciary, all the things that we associate with, American civics classes and so on that we learn about. But when you look at the U.S. post-World War II and the creation of the national security state, you have something else. And you could call it a dual state if you're just going to say, oh, the national security state with the CIA and J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and the NSA, spying on everyone. This is like a national security state. So now we have like a dual state. And that's an argument that some people have made. I go further and say that it's really a three-part kind of state. It's a tripartite state with a democratic state that we can see and a national security state that we can partially see, even though they use a lot of state secrecy and can act, to overthrow governments and do things in other countries. But I go further and say that even beyond that, there's another element, which is oligarchic power. And so the one definition of the deep state in the big systemic sense would be all those institutions that affect top-down rule in a nominal democracy. So you don't need a deep state if you are Louis the 14th. You would just say, I am the state. There's no deep state. It's me. I'm the sovereign. I'm the Sun King. I am the state. But in a democracy, it's the people. It's the demos that has sovereignty. We are told, but we know that that's not true, because we see that presidents don't change very much on major policy issues, and we also have a couple of presidents, at least a couple, but really more elections. The more you look into it, that are swung by power that comes from an unseen source, like the Kennedy presidency. JFK gets killed in 1963 in a pretty obvious plot by powerful actors, powerful enough to cover it up and then blame it on the enemies of the regime, the communists, right? The antithesis. And then the Kennedy brother, also in 1968, is another year where the Democratic state was undermined because of political assassination. So RFK, who, by the way, was planning to investigate his brother's assassination 5 years earlier, but he gets shot in the head, this time by a Palestinian, of all people. So there you see the Kennedy brothers will show you the two big enemies. Their assassins show you the two big enemies of the U.S. regime, in a sense, which is, if you want to be at all relevant in the U.S. politics, you have to be pro-capitalist and Zionist, which means you can't be friendly to communists or Palestinians in the bigger sense. Okay, so this deep state that we have in the U.S. is oligarchic control. It's easy enough to understand that the actors with real power in the U.S. are oligarchs of corporate wealth, and they can buy foundations and fund think tanks, fund political campaigns. They represent a source of power that ultimately affects our system of governance. And if things break down, like the national security state is being investigated in the 1970s because of Watergate, the CIA is being investigated, they can create things like the Safari Club that are basically totally off the books and not even under the control of the government, and they can operate that way. Or if you're the CIA in, I don't remember what year it was, but this was under Trump, his first term, and they wanted to surveil and even plan the assassination of Julian Assange, they don't even have the CIA do this. They actually subcontract it to a private firm, which was the security team at the Sands Casino. Sands Casino is owned by Sheldon Adelson, who is the top, one of the top, if not the top donors to the Republican Party. He's dead now, but Adelson is his Sands Casino was originally a Lansky joint. I mean, it was literally a Lansky Las Vegas enterprise for laundering drug money.
I just stayed there in Macau.
At the Sands Casino, it's huge, right?
Yeah.
I only know of it, and the Chinese government has investigated it. And it's the big source of money for his organization, for Adelson, and they give huge amounts of money to Republican congressmen, and they were investigated by the Chinese for potentially money laundering. I think they're surveilled a lot. I honestly wonder why China lets them operate, given their past, but that's beside the point. The key point of this idea of the deep state is that there's so much top-down control, and the influence of wealth is so over-determining that you really cannot explain our regime just by reference to the democratically elected officials that we have or the bureaucracy of the national security state. There is another deeper force there, and it's oligarchic power. So that's the deep state in that bigger overall systemic sense. All those institutions that allow for top-down rule in a nominal democracy. Now, the deep state in the more clandestine sense is really the clandestine deep state. You could use it to refer to all of these actors who get involved and participate in deep events, clandestine events, covert operations that have a big impact on political outcomes in the U.S. or elsewhere in the world. So that would be the people that overthrow the nexus between the intelligence agency and the oligarchs who want to overthrow this or that particular government would be an example of this, or the interplay between Meyer Lansky's crime syndicate, in the mid 20th century, and the officials at the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the FBI and CIA counterintelligence, which were all essentially protecting Lansky, meaning they were all protecting the National Crime Syndicate, which essentially was like the Standard Oil of organized crime in the United States. And Lansky himself said at one point, the syndicate is bigger than U.S. Steel, which was the biggest corporation in the U.S. when it was created, of course, with Carnegie and Morgan money. So the organized crime element is a huge part of it, and it is tied to the interests of oligarchs and factions of oligarchs. And what I have come to focus on more recently, because of the way that the history of the last couple of years has unfolded, is the Zionist contingency of this oligarchy and the role that it plays in the deep state in both senses of it. In the bigger systemic sense, if you think that the two of the biggest donors for like the Democrats and the Republicans respectively are Adelson, who's a super Zionist birthright trip, funder, send all these young Jewish kids to Israel and say, this is your birthright to steal this land and slaughter these people. And then for elections as well, they pay for a lot of elections. They give a ton of money on the Republican side, and on the Democratic side. In the past, it was this guy named Haim Sabin, I think is his name, and he funded the Brookings think tank, which is supposed to be a liberal think tank, but they end up being very neocon in foreign policy because of all of this money of Zionists who are Americans typically. But their main political focus is Zionism. And so, this is a part of the clandestine deep state because Zionists end up doing dirty work for the U.S., for example, like with the Sands Casino and Adelson and Assange. But then also because in the systemic sense, they fund so many politicians, they fund think tanks, networks of Zionists give donations to universities and independent high schools and so on, to create a situation where the democratic civil society that we're supposed to have can't even really function because everybody is dependent upon so many people are dependent on money from super Zionist sources. And they don't want to upset them. So it's like a kind of a dark governing influence that cannot and is not and really cannot be too easily explained in textbooks, because you really are talking about a sort of institutionalized, generally conspiratorial type of political activism or activity. And what we really get at is a kind of lawless top-down system that presents itself as democracy. That's the heart of it, that this is really more of a top-down, despotic, lawless system designed to reproduce an imperial capitalist empire, an imperial capitalist system that enriches oligarchs beyond all imagining. I mean, the number of billionaires that we have in every sector of the economy extracting rent from us is becoming more and more absurd and overbearing for the people in the economy of the U.S. And so this is really what we're talking about. All of these forces that are very much against the demos, very much anti-democratic, but have control of the apex of power.
So just to clarify the definitions you're using here, if we went back to the founding of the U.S., you wouldn't have a national security state. You wouldn't have the Trumanite network. You would just have the institutions that we all know as comprising, U.S. democracy. But then you would still have a deep state at that time by your definition, right? Like, because the oligarchy that owned the country and created the Constitution, et cetera, they would have been a kind of incipient deep state, probably with less, underworld connections. Although, if you're a slaver, I mean, how are you any different from a criminal organization anyway? But is that understanding basically correct, that you could say at the founding you had a deep state and a Madisonian state, but it was only until after World War II that you had the creation of an actual national security state, but you had a deep state all throughout, because the deep state is essentially the oligarchy that owns and runs the country.
Yeah, there are absolutely analogs to the tripartite state, even at the founding of the country in the U.S. And the democratic part is obviously the democratic side of early USA, where you did have elections and so on, and you had a free press, relative to other places in the world. And there was a security state to the extent that there's an army in case there's rebellions. They put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And a lot of the more the most criminal parts of the early part of the U.S. are just wrapped up in imperialism. So the domestic economy wasn't so huge that there was an enormous footprint of like organized crime, like we would think of the crime syndicate later in the history of the United States. But into the Western expansion involved a mentality and practices that are hard to argue were you can't argue they weren't really criminal in their essence. I mean, you're talking about genocide and slavery and so on. I mean, these are not just criminality of like organized criminality. These are organized crimes against humanity, which were the basis of the early U.S. But they didn't have the developed national security state in the same way. That said, there were ways that violence would be used to make sure that the oligarchs would win the day if the laws and the democratic processes weren't going to work out in the way they wanted to. They always win. So oligarchy really, every civilization, you could say there's a deep state of every civilization in a sense, because there's always power that is in the hands of a smaller number of people. It's always oligarchy. We have not transcended oligarchy very well, although you could argue that some socialist countries are much more down the road of doing that than other places. I mean, the extent that you can see oligarchy most easily is when power and wealth are concentrated in the hands of a small minority who is enriched by pretty much everything that the mass of the population does, in terms of economic activity and so on. So yeah, there's always been a deep state and there's always been an oligarchy. Its evolution after World War II in the United States has been my focus. And when I wrote the book, I traced out some of the cleavages between the factions that comprise this oligarchy. And then I've clarified that more in recent years as the Gaza genocide has brought things into relief, along with other kind of discoveries that I've made in recent years that show me that to me indicate that Zionism is something unique and powerful and important to grapple with, and that we are kind of ill-suited to do so because of indoctrination about anti-Semitism and what it is and is not acceptable to say about Israel. And ultimately, I am not on the side of the more right-wing conspiracists or whoever who don't really have a problem with capitalism or imperialism per se, but focus on the conspiratorial activity of Zionists, which is, and some of these people will do good work because there is so much terrible conspiratorial things that they are doing. But I think it's a mistake to just try to fixate on that and not recognize that it's the system that kind of created this Game of Thrones environment for oligarchic factions to act the way that they act. That's the bigger system. The structure of the politico-economic order is what determines how oligarchic factions are able to conduct themselves and what they can actually get away with. And I think because we created a whole society based on the acquisition of money and exploitation of people to make money and the expropriation of people through imperialistic practices, that we really centered we centered a civilization around the darkest elements of civilization. I mean, the civilization is a more complex mode of organizing societies, is based on some level of stratification and specialization and exploitation, because if you don't have any exploitation, you can't have people specializing in this or that. You can't really have human progress as we think about it. So progress is tied to kind of brutal forces, but we put those brutal forces of profiteering and exploitation and expropriation, that's pretty much the center of our cosmology in the West. That's what capitalism has been. And the U.S. is the purest expression of this, because there's no pre-bourgeois society in the U.S. In the U.S. We came over purely as a business venture, sort of a Christian, but more for appearances than actual substance. And we're just pure capitalist imperialism at the top of the U.S. And that's the way it's always been. And that's what gives our oligarchy its particular flavor, even though oligarchy, as you say, Peter, and the deep state is pretty much a defining aspect of civilization's top-down power.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So what I find so important about this discussion and about your work is that it highlights it actually it dares, you can almost say it dares to highlight the extreme criminality indeed of oligarchic power. And that was something that was relegated to the realm of conspiracies and weird thinking and all that kind of stuff. And like you said, that was propaganda, not just about Zionism and that you're anti-Semitic if you critique it, but the propaganda is everywhere. I mean, we are in education, and I mean the things that we get taught is all so superficial. It's the outside layer of what is going on. It's never the deeper layer. And when we talk about oligarchic power that is running the world, we're really talking about dark, evil, murderous, genocidal pedophiles. Yeah, it may sound really, really weird. In the old days, you would say, "Oh, that's those QAnon people who think like that." No, we're actually being run by this insane amount of sick criminality. You know what I mean? And these people, of course, also engage in conspiracies to maintain their power. You were just talking about the Palestinian patsy they used to shoot. Who was it? The Kennedy?
Yeah,
Who shot
RFK.
RFK, yes. And now you have, of course, during the genocide, suddenly some weird Arab, maybe patsy, popping up in Manchester doing something against people in a synagogue. And people are still not discussing these possibilities that oligarchic power can set these kind of things up. You know what I mean? And that brings me to a question that I have for you about what just happened. I just want to hear your opinion on it. How do you see the whole Charlie Kirk situation when we take all these things into account?
I mean, as someone who spent a lot of time, maybe too much time, looking at the Kennedy assassination and well, both of them, the Kennedy assassinations, the the story that they gave came under enormous scrutiny right away, and everything about it, the ballistics, the story that they try to tell, the story about the guy who seems to be a patsy. I mean, it's interesting because you have guys who are not typically the first to jump to, a conspiratorial explanation on this kind of thing, coming to speak rather candidly about it, like Max Blumenthal, Larry Wilkerson, Larry Johnson, people that haven't really gone so far on like things like 9/11, for example, right? But in this case, the more that comes out about it, the more it just seems like the story doesn't really make any sense. The evidence is bad on every level that they have. It's so suspicious. The fact they say he was shot with this huge rifle round, and yet there's no indication of the kind of damage to him that would have caused. So, and the person himself, the most clearly incriminating thing would be these text messages, but they seem so contrived and ridiculous, like written by somebody who just watches Law and Order and like thinks about checking boxes of the like details you'd need for a conviction, and then trying to put it into a text. And even the choice of patsy, which is to me important because I mentioned the communist patsy and the Palestinian patsy. Well, this guy is a pro-trans person, right? Which to me is a big culture war thing that they have ginned up in recent years. So it's like that's the perfect thing. If you can blame it on a trans activist, this gets people, because people have been agitated about this particular issue. I think that the culture war stuff sort of works that way. You freak people out by going after cultural things, and you politicize cultural things, that are whatever it is to push the envelope to get people agitated becomes the political issue, that the politicized issue that you want to focus on. But it's really an issue of culture and personal etiquette and things, rather, by and large. It's on the internet, the discourse around it is like, do you support all of the things that the pro-trans activists are for, or are you an evil bigot? And then the other side sees it very differently, right? But it's not. When you live in a society like we're talking about, where it's really a dictatorship bent on global dominance that's totally lawless, so you don't have a democracy, then what's the point of getting so worked up about politicized cultural issues as though you're going to change them through normal political speech and processes? Meanwhile, you're really living under this brutal, despotic regime that's not even really politics, because there is no part of what we're dealing with is the fact that there is no real political system for us to engage in other than to talk about it and complain about, because really the important decisions are all top down. And in that kind of a context, these culture war things are not, it's foolish to spend time arguing about them, and to take them, especially to take, for people on the left to take a minority position and then make it sort of a litmus test for whether someone is a good person, whether they agree with you on this particular culture issue. It's like the perfect prop. So it's not about, they're not even really trying to unite us against communists or whatever. It's actually a divisive kind of patsy choice, right? So this is, to me, it points to a deep event, most likely. I mean, maybe they'll come up with some way to explain it all, and it's a coincidence. But when you consider the assassination in light of his real considerable shift against Israel, I mean, he allowed Tucker Carlson to speak at that event where he just insulted Bill Ackman, who is one of the top billionaires, agents of Zionism in the U.S., and he's just calling him he's really saying, what kind of society do we live in where a guy like this can acquire so much power? He's not even good at anything, or he's not especially clever. I mean, that would have infuriated this guy who supposedly, I don't know if this is, I can't remember, it's hard to suss out what's been confirmed or disconfirmed after the fact, but it was reported that he gave a reward. Ackman gave an award to the family of the kid for turning him in Utah, the shooter or patsy. So I'm not totally sure if that was later turned out to be like an internet rumor that wasn't true. But either way, it was remarkable what Kirk was saying, and that he was saying, I'm going to have to break with Israel, and he reportedly told people he was worried they were going to kill him, and then he dies. And you consider that in light of the fact that they just bought TikTok, they just bought CBS, I mean, Zionist actors did, because they really want to control the whole media and make sure that there's no platform where people are allowed to just say things about Palestinians. Like with TikTok, that's what
everything now. Everything is now Zionist owned, pretty much. It's so scary if you think about it. Pretty much everything that we use.
Yeah. And how did that come to be the case? Because I don't think in the early years after the Cold War, the oligarchy was the power and wealth were that concentrated in the hands of Jewish Zionist, bazillionaires. Something changed in the way the economy played out. And that's kind of a different question, but something has changed in that regard. And it's so brazen. And when you think about the fact that these are people who we know will kill people for, if they deem it necessary, they'll kill people. Enormous amounts of people, children, and they don't even care if the world sees it. Ultimately, I mean, they would rather them not, but they will do it even though they know the world's watching, and that they are going to brazenly buy all these outlets in broad daylight suggests that they are obsessed with controlling the narrative. And then the damage that Kirk would have done if he continued on that path, it's a very obvious motive. It's a very obvious motive for people who we know kill people all the time, and who, when the U.S. wanted to kill Assange, they hired these same kind of actors. They didn't even use the CIA. They, for some reason, thought that the Zionists would be better. In this case, the Sands Casino, which is, literally, like I said, an offshoot of the National Crime Syndicate and Meyer Lansky. And that's who we contract assassinations to. It's like Murder Incorporated. So there's so many reasons to suspect that Israel was likely, or the Zionist neocon clandestine actors, let's say. So they don't even necessarily have to be Israeli. They could be American-based. They're so intertwined with the American, national security state that it would be hard to separate the two. But there's so many, the way that whole thing was handled, the sort of destruction of evidence, the way that the security team around him acted in the immediate aftermath, it is a very suspicious assassination that brings to mind these other suspicious assassinations.
Speaking of bullshit, one thing I wanted to cover was political science a bit, because in your book, one of the things that really stood out was, I forget, sort of towards the beginning, I think you go into how the poverty of political science. And it's funny because I just kind of wrote that whole field off early on. I think when I was in college, I took a class and I'm like, wow, this is absolute horseshit. I have no interest in this whatsoever. I actually got a PhD technically in political science. It was in a political psychology program. And I thought that all political psychology programs were in social psychology departments. So I was kind of disappointed to find out I would have to go through a poli sci department for 4.5 years or so. But the thing is, you have this field that is supposed to illuminate, how politics works, how it operates. And in your book, you kind of describe how it has these methodological strictures that have the final result of making it useless, like just completely disconnected from reality because you're so restricted in what you're allowed to do. You have this quote from C. Wright Mills where he says, this is the question I'm interested in answering. I'm going to use whatever method can actually shine light on this question I'm interested in answering. Whereas in the poli-sci mainstream, it seems like they go about it the exact opposite way. They say, what are what's the fad, the statistical fad du jour? What are the methods that are allowed by the top journals? And then we'll restrict our investigations to whatever those methods will allow us to do. Now, I look at it, kind of from an evolutionary perspective, and you can just, from that perspective, you just see that there's this strong selection pressure against anything that will jeopardize the status quo, that anything that could upset the apple cart, overturn the apple cart. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience of political science and why you think it's just such a it's such a shambles. Like there's just it's really pathetic. I could just blather on for hours about this, but I think the anecdote that really illustrates this best is at a friend's house, she had copies of like the top journal and poli-sci lying around being used as what do you put your glass on it? What do you call it? Coaster, yeah. And so we decided just for shits and giggles to like open up some of these issues and like randomly pick a page. And unless it was a theory article, everything in there was just pure garbage. Very elaborate use of statistics. Like for an applied statistics field, I guess it would be doing well. But if you're trying to actually be a scientist of politics, it's just so pathetic. What do you think is the mechanism? I just kind of see it as you have this strong selection pressure against anything that would upset those with power. But how do you see the kind of mutilation that has occurred in this pathetic discipline?
Well, if you look back at the 30s and early 40s, the National Political Science Association, or the Top Political Science Association, whatever it was called, and the Top Historians Association, they had the same president, and it was Charles Beard. And Charles Beard is famous for a few things, including the conspiracy theory of the 14th Amendment, where he said that the 14th Amendment was written in such a way as to allow lawyers for railroad companies, American oligarchs essentially, to later argue and interpret it in such a way that it could be applied to corporations and such. And so it allowed... Which is
empirically the way it was used in more court cases than its use for its ostensible purpose. Yeah.
Right. Which is, it's so absurd when you look at the 14th Amendment and the historical context, the aftermath of the Civil War, to think that, oh, yes, it naturally should apply to a corporation, which is a person. I mean, it makes no sense at all. And so he was explaining this sort of conspiratorial agency of oligarchs and political power in the U.S. And the last book that Charles Beard wrote was on Pearl Harbor. And he essentially said that actors in the Roosevelt administration must have somehow engineered or known about, provoked, allowed to happen Pearl Harbor so that the U.S. could enter World War II and go for a position of global, empire, hegemony, leadership, whatever we want to call it. So this was this is how radical, relatively speaking, American social science was for that little window of time, that followed the Great Depression and then the beginning of World War II. But his last book on Pearl Harbor, he kind of got disappeared. And you have the rise in the social sciences and political science most dramatically of behavioralism and an obsession with quantitative methods and with trying to make the social sciences speak with the same kind of certainty and language of the hard sciences. And I believe that this was done. This was this was engineered by foundations and oligarchs with power to have sway at universities and so on. And they did this because it was useful for them. So, but there's
Karl
still,
Popper. Karl Popper is an
oh
important
yeah,
one.
he's a guy they would have loved, because he's a no conspiracy guy. He believes that there's,
Methodological individualism, no context, just focus purely on the behavioral aspect of the social sciences.
yeah, and they, so the sort of antidote to this, or the hero of this period in social science, is C. Wright Mills. And he was the most famous social scientist in the U.S. And because of his, his prose was comprehensible. You could read it if you weren't a specialist, if you were just an educated person. And he said important things about U.S. society and the way that it was changing. And if you read The Power Elite and the way that he describes the sort of top-down synergy of the command posts in the U.S. and big business, the military state, and the political system, he was inspired to write this by a German defector, Ernst Frankel. No, it wasn't Ernst Frankel that he wrote about the deep state. It was the person that wrote Behemoth, Franz Neumann. He wrote this book, Behemoth, about the rise of the Nazi cartel system and then the Nazi regime. I mean, the German cartel system, and how, when threatened with revolution, it created this Nazi regime. And Mills wrote that, and he thought, the U.S. has these kind of super powerful top-down oligarchic actors at the apex of the political economy. And so the U.S. could be something similar to this sort of Nazi thing, even though I don't know if he ever said similar to the Nazis, but he said he was motivated by this book on the Nazis to look at the American system and focus on these scary top-down aspects of it. And that, after he wrote this book, which was discussed near and far, and it really influenced the Eisenhower's farewell speech, where he talked about the military-industrial complex, that was written by a political scientist and a person who was obviously influenced by Mills and his critiques of the privately incorporated permanent war economy. So Mills was a person with enormous influence at the time, and the next project he wanted to do was on the cultural apparatus, and how he wanted to do a follow-up to The Power Elite and he applied to the Ford Foundation for a grant to do something on the cultural apparatus, which is the way that the apex of political power determines what the culture is across a civilization. So Hollywood, the media, the universities, civil society, how all of these things are influenced by top-down power, which in a capitalist society means oligarchic wealth, right? And the Ford Foundation would not give him money for this, to do this study. And he dies in the early 60s. I have suspicions that he may have been poisoned. And I came across a sociologist years ago. I wish I would have bookmarked these sites, but he was somebody who was a sociologist at a university and was fairly well known. And he had the same suspicions. I believe that Mills came down ill during a debate over Cuba with some really passionate anti-communist people, and they may have poisoned him or something, because he had health difficulties after that. But whether he was poisoned or not is kind of beside the point. The point is, there was this brilliant social scientist, and he was making a lot of the same critiques that you or I would make about social science at the same time. And if you go back and read Mills' writings, you can see he's saying all the right things about social science that apply to the present day. And he was marginalized. They wouldn't let him write. They wouldn't give him funding to do this new study, which would have been very impactful. It was the Ford Foundation that denied him. We later know that they were a conduit for CIA funds. They were essentially an asset of the CIA in terms of manipulating culture. They funded these cultural organizations all around the world. So when you look at just that case in microcosm, it kind of tells you what went wrong with this, because Mills wanted to write about the cultural apparatus and expose top-down control of our society through cultural domination. But instead, the organization says, no funding for you. Instead, we're going to manipulate and control the cultural apparatus itself, through our funding of all these different enterprises that the CIA tells us about. So right there, you have a really good example of what went wrong. And in political science, they make a fetish of things that can be statistically quantified, especially about public opinion polls and this and that. And they run them through all sorts of regression and try to find statistically significant correlations and this and that. And it's this whole ritual of trying to determine causality through, mathematical means for political problems. And it's a methodology that occasionally has some useful applications, I suppose, but it presupposes a transparent society, a society where the rule of law prevails, and where democratic institutions are basically functional and able to translate the public will into some sort of action by the government, right, and by elected officials. So if you don't really live in a lawless society, and public opinions are formed by the same sort of despotic forces at the top that are the antithesis of democracy, then this is a methodology that's just going to kind of reaffirm the status quo and never really get to the root of the problem. I mean, it took political science until like 2014 or 2016 to use those methods and do it and show, in political science terms, that the U.S. is essentially an oligarchy of wealth. The Gillens and Page paper of 2014, which uses quantitative methods to show how little democracy there is in the U.S., right? But and it's an interesting, important work, I suppose. But really, Mills explained all these things so much better in 1956, and it's really going to take us this long to like say that grass is green in political science because the methodological straitjacket they put themselves in. I mean, another way to understand why political science is so bad is to look at economics, because that discipline is also such it's such bullshit top to bottom. And you have ideas like Milton Friedman saying, no, there's no such thing as rent, right? And then meanwhile, we look at our economy and we are just beset by rentier billionaires. But yet the economics discipline kind of focuses as though Friedman was correct and there's no such thing as rent, and don't think about these questions. And so the political economy,
let alone the stupid invisible hand.
Yeah, well, and
ridiculous invisible hand.
It's way worse than Adam Smith, because Adam Smith actually understood that the rents of feudalism were what were damaging the economy, and it was true. It kept the economy in a form of stasis because of these rentier landlords. But the problem is with capitalism, the people at the top are basically those who are most effective rent seekers, and the monopolists especially, and people in high finance, people who control the way finance is regulated, and so on. So since political economy is ultimately what determines the power structure of a civilization, politics, political science, and economics are going to be the two most bullshit disciplines in the West, because they have to be. You cannot have people really working to illuminate politics or economics, both or political economy, because those things are the most important in terms of maintaining illusions and sort of bullshit orthodoxies so that the whole criminal enterprise can keep running.
Yeah. H.L. Mencken, of all people, wrote, I think, the best essay on this, called The Dismal Science, where he basically just does a political economic analysis of academia and says, people with power and wealth, they don't give a shit about chemistry or astronomy or what have you. But you better, they absolutely do care about economics, or he doesn't say political science, but you can kind of read it in. Any science that deals with the source of their power is going to be one that they really want to influence. And so I think that's really the reason why political science is apologetics for capitalist democracy, and economics is apologetics for neoliberal capitalism.
It's something that has become even more clear to me in recent years, and it especially applies to males, I think, because of patriarchy. Women occupy a kind of different position in society, and so it's not maybe as obvious, but the cult of individualism in the U.S. that is sort of there as a cultural facet, right? This cult of individualism and the man prevailing over his adversaries and becoming the successful, individual, right? The rugged individualist. But in reality, everything is corporate. So nothing, the individual is really, unless he's an athlete, a boxer, or something like that, or a writer, really what you're doing is not individual. It's really corporate, and involves, corporate power. And so because these ideals are, we've accepted this American cult of individualism, and yet you pretty much fail if you're not tied to corporate power, by the metrics of success, and you don't really enjoy the prosperity and economic security to have much of a good life in the US if you're not successful in this corporate world. It's like this kind of schizophrenia and a crisis of manhood in the West, I think, in that we are made to believe all of these things about what we can and should do as individuals and think of ourselves that way. But we don't really, you don't really succeed in that way except for a number of people. And it causes, I think, enormous psychological distress among people, and
Exactly. Yeah.
a lack of material security and wherewithal uh, about the future, or lack of security in the present over time. This makes people kind of insane, and so our system and the way that it holds up for us, impossible to achieve ideals while exploiting us and or just making us very precarious in our existence. This is affecting people on the cultural, psychological level all the time. It's the overriding variable for pretty much everything that you're looking at in our culture. Is this capitalist, imperial capitalist empire, the imperial capitalist system in terminal decline, that's totally lawless and really can't be defended honestly, and yet it has so much power that we're all subjected to it. And this is just, it's emasculating in itself to be so powerless all the time. And that, I think, is a part of this crisis of masculinity in the West, as it would be described. It's not, oh, it's toxic masculinity, and if just these men would stop being jerks, things would be better. It's like we have a system that is crushing people, and it manifests in so many weird ways. I mean, the things that you see from people, I mean, I have a kid, and so the youth sports is like totally insane, and these men are insane. Like, they are insane. And it's like a sick kind of culture. There's no real, because everything is about getting yours, and if you fix everything as much as you can fix it, because the fix rules in America. It's like that ethos goes down to every area of life, even things involving sports with kids, for example, but every other area of business, or in anything that you're doing. This is the ethos of the U.S., and it's a sick culture in a sense. It's really it's unmoored from any of the things that traditionally restrain the most rapacious and antisocial aspects of human civilization. They are so unleashed at this point, and we are just living through a terrible time. And I don't say that to depress people. I say it so that people have a way to understand the depressing times they live in, and take a step back and recognize what it is, and then maybe this affects how people can approach their own lives and other people that they're around, and maybe be more sympathetic to people, because this is kind of a hellscape that we're living in, but it's naturalized to us because it's all we've known.
Yeah. It's good for people to realize not to blame themselves. To be well adapted to a sick society is, no form of health. But you mentioned that the U.S. empire is fundamentally unjustifiable, but that brings up another lovely subdiscipline of poli-sci, international relations, which essentially is apologetics for empire.
Yeah.
And it's got, a very elaborate kind of just justification structure. You live in this anarchic world. There's no global police that's going to help you.
Peter, can you get your microphone? Or?
Oh, yeah. Therefore, every state needs to just single-mindedly maximize power to become the biggest rat bastard possible. And that's actually morally good, because if you don't do that, you're flirting with extinction. So it's actually morally good to be a rat bastard, because that's just the way the world works. And, that's too bad, but, we need to be clear-eyed. And so, if I spent a lot of time recently listening to talks at the Council on Foreign Relations to really get in the heads of our ruling class. And it's really remarkable, because, you can see the effect of that way of thinking on, or that kind of indoctrination on the people making up the CFR. You see very little sign, what if any, I don't think really any, of doubt, of questioning, of moral interrogation. It's all just assumed away. And everything the US empire is doing is not just to maximize power, but is also morally good. And it's really, I don't really have a point other than to decry that, but it these disciplines that are so close to power, I think, have been fundamentally mutilated by that proximity, and
Well,
they end up being of limited value.
it shows that our
To put it mildly.
education it shows that our education system, Peter, is just part of the machine. It's part of the propaganda machine, whether it's media, whether it's the universities, high schools, etc., etc. It's all part of that big oligarchic machine that wants us to think in a certain way. In the old days, we thought it was all hyperbolic and exaggerated, and today we realize it's true. And I am in that sense very similar to Aaron. If people follow our Substack, you will also notice that I'm very pessimistic about the system that we are in. I also I totally agree with you, Aaron, that I also think we are in one of the darkest civilizations in human history. And whilst we have been taught that we are in the most enlightened civilization in human history, but if you do a little bit of investigation into certain civilizations, such as the European American civilization in North America, for example, or the Arab civilization before it was completely destroyed by colonialism, you realize that, for example, things as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the kind of how do you say that, the diverse civilizations that you had in those days, that actually maybe even probably trumped the kind of civilization that we are in today.
Yes.
And like you said, it's all super exploitative. It's like you said, the men don't feel like there is a crisis among men. I would say it's not just that men feel powerless. I mean, it's also a system that really predates on the most powerless. I mean, it's not I always say it's not a coincidence that in these Epstein Islands and these pedophilia islands, almost every single well-known, very rich person was found over there. It's sometimes I wonder who did not go. You know what I mean? It's like there's this system conditions people to just, especially the more powerful they get, to prey on the most exploitative, or the ones who are most easiest to exploit, the weakest in society. That arouses them. That gives them arousal. You know what I mean? And it's that kind of system that we are molded in. That this kind of phenomenon, that kind of sick pedophilic kind of urges, that it is so prevalent among the powerful. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, let me give you an anecdote that I think captures this really well. I recently interviewed Sibel Edmonds, who was an FBI whistleblower, and she uncovered a whole lot of really mind-blowing things about the U.S. and Al Qaeda by going through Turkish intercepts that hadn't been translated at the FBI and that were marked as maybe non-relevant. But then after 9/11, they go back and listen to them, and she uncovers all of these jihadi networks that are often tied to like Turkish lobby, which is sort of a satellite of the Israel lobby. And it's really disturbing. But one anecdote in particular pertained to Dennis Hastert. And there was a 2005 Vanity Fair article written about Sibel Edmonds' case. And they talk about Hastert. It writes about how Hastert received something like $200,000 in small donations from Turkish sources that were connected to the heroin traffic. And that got written up in Vanity Fair. And this guy was the Speaker of the House, and nothing really came of that. He remained the Speaker of the House for a number of terms past that, but he didn't sue them. You know, Vanity Fair is a big magazine. If they say something about you that's not true, you could sue them for libel. He didn't do that. And yet it didn't matter. It didn't get discussed by the rest of the press. It didn't become an election issue for him, I suppose. What she told me, and I was listening to her for years because she had a podcast, because she really wasn't allowed to talk about, she was gagged by the State Secrets Act, but she eventually she wanted to tell her story because she thought it was really important politically. And I knew that Hastert was a pedophile from listening to her because she had talked about that on her shows in the past. Now, recently, when I interviewed her, I asked her to explain this. And she said that in 2005, she tried to get that into the article on Dennis Hastert because there were intercepts that she heard of people saying, oh yeah, we've got a 12 and a 14-year-old boy to 14-year-old kids to bring to Denny Boy. And then she asked, like, who is this Denny Boy? And then the other person that she was working with said Dennis Hastert. And so they were going to write about this, but Vanity Fair said, well, we're going to need more than just two sources for this, because somebody else at the FBI had already confirmed this, that Sibel knew. So they had two sources. They could have run that. And so they get four sources altogether. And then Vanity Fair still doesn't run this. And then I don't know what year it was, maybe 2012, 2014. It comes out that Dennis Hastert had been a pedophile back when he was a wrestling coach, because he was a high school wrestling coach before he became a congressman. But Sibel was saying that she heard tapes, intercepts of them talking about his being a sexual blackmail thrall, long ago. And this was during his years in office. That part gets left out of the story. So the longest serving Republican Speaker of the House in U.S. history, Dennis Hastert, was a high school wrestling coach who was a pedophile. And then he went from there to being a congressman and then the Speaker of the House. And he wasn't a charismatic person. He was around Chicago, which is, of course, a very mobbed up place. I don't know exactly what happened, but one possible explanation is that he was arrested as a pedophile, and somebody had the wherewithal to know that these people could become political assets and then groomed him for a political career simply because he was a pedophile and he was totally controllable. I mean, that seems to be the most, if that wasn't the way that he got into the office, it seems to be the best explanation for why he stayed there so long, because he wasn't, as I say, charismatic or a great politician or anything else, or an accomplished lawyer or anything, as I understand it. He was just a vile pedophile, and that gave him the credential to be the third in line for the presidency in the United States, one of the most powerful political actors. And the kicker to this is, if you understand how many people the U.S. political system, kills annually in terms of the structural violence, maybe 9 million people a year or so, more than 9 million die of like malnutrition, lack of access to potable water, lack of access to basic health care. This is like a Holocaust year in, year out. And so Dennis Hastert, Speaker of the House, prolific pedophile, his pedophile crimes are actually in the aggregate like almost nothing. They don't amount to anything. They're insignificant compared to the actual system that he protects. But on the individual level, we're like, my God, this is horrendous. How can this be? And yet it's actually it's not even impactful at all compared to the system that he protects. And that really is that to me captures a lot of the evil of this system. And it's starting to register with people with the Epstein things. Like, how can they get away with this? If this, we tolerate all sorts of political abuses and corruption, but like the trafficking of children to people in high places to blackmail them so that they'll act against the public interest, this is unacceptable. And I think that this sort of gradual understanding, even incomplete as it is, and not with good political analysis, especially when you're talking about the right, this is showing an empire that is facing a legitimacy crisis like it's never faced, at the same time that it's losing its material wherewithal to successfully determine the outcomes of military confrontations. I mean, I think that Israel lost the war with Iran. NATO is losing in Ukraine. A war in Taiwan would be a disaster. I don't think a war in Venezuela. I think a war in Venezuela would be a disaster, although I don't know if it would have success in the short term or not. I mean, we are just the empire in terms of soft power and hard power is in the worst position in my lifetime, really probably in the history of Western civilization, if you consider it, because it's been consolidated under this U.S. leadership, and now this whole project is just so tainted and illegitimate that it can't be defended unless you just ignore enormous amounts of reality. You have to have a made-up version of reality to even argue remotely on behalf of the prevailing order that we live under.
What stood out to me in that interview is when she mentioned, I think, a colleague of hers at the FBI who was tasked, I forget for which administration, but tasked by some presidential administration to vet candidates for federal judgeships. And I think it was a he, ended up quitting because he was so just disheartened by the fact that the judges with the most dirt on them were the ones that were most likely to be appointed. And you can understand the logic perfectly well. Like, if you've got dirt on somebody, then you can always call them up in a case that you care about and say, you know, I really want this outcome. Whereas you couldn't really do that with a clean judge. So that kind of the use of blackmail in that instance was really, really just kind of shocked me.
Right.
Aaron. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, the judges, control of the judiciary is key, and that seems to be a recurring theme. There's a little bit about that in my book, and I think I cite Michael Glennon, who just writes about how when it comes to national security issues, the courts around DC, these guys are vetted and they're investigated. This is common practice. So this is like the idea of an independent judiciary is always dubious if politicians get to appoint these guys. But then on top of it, they get vetted by national security people just to make sure that they are corruptible. I mean, we have a system that like investigates people to make sure they are corrupt.
Yeah. Hey, Aaron, can I ask you one last question? And if you have time, or do you have to go?
Sure, of course.
Okay, great. So I want to ask you one last question. It's not going to be a small question, but it's up to you how you answer. And I think a lot of people in our audience are also very interested in this. And this is going to be a tough question, but I have to ask it. What would you say is the deep state benefit? Let's say empire's benefit in combination, of course, with the deep state. It's all deeply intertwined. Of an ongoing 2-year-long genocide. I mean, I'm at a loss here. Well, what's the benefit here?
I think this gets into one of the core issues of the American empire and one of the divisive things on the left, which is how do we think of the actual political regime that we live under and what determines its outcomes. So for some people on the left, they would say, well, Israel is just a U.S. proxy. It enacts U.S. policy in the region. And if Israel's doing it, it's because the U.S. wants it. It wants to destabilize the Middle East and use Israel as its attack dog. That's one interpretation of that. I would say that if you look at the wars of the 21st century and the fact that they've been promoted and prosecuted by neocon actors with a loyalty to Zionism and to the idea of Greater Israel, basically laid out in the Clean Break Report of 1996. Then if you look at these wars, these forever wars, the war on terror, the war in Iraq, what we did in Libya, what we did in Syria, the occupation of Afghanistan for 2 decades, this has been coterminous with a massive decline in U.S. hegemony and prestige in the world. It's perpetuating the end of dollar hegemony because we have forced countries to come up with alternatives to the dollar. And that was a source of U.S. power, but they abused that in order to go after this unipolar project for a new American century vision. So these have been disastrous in terms of just shrewd imperialism. We haven't been acting as, pragmatic, rational imperialists. And I think that the Zionism in particular is what has propelled this, that it is something that is hard to wrap your mind around for a number of reasons. Among them, the fact that we're so discouraged from looking at the way that these actors operate, in the bigger picture. I mean, it's funny that one of the things that Charlie Kirk was saying about his woes for the last few months when talking about pro-Israeli donors pulling out of his coalition and so on, he says they act in such a stereotypical fashion. Right? Like they act like all the stereotypes. And it's like, but when you think about that, is he accurate about that? And yes, he is. I mean, they literally have like the guy from Minnesota, Norm Coleman, and he was on stage. He's a Zionist Jewish American. And he was saying, what's going on social media and TikTok? Come on. We own Facebook. We're the masters of the universe. Jews own social media. He says something to that effect, right? Which if you'd said that, 6 years ago, if you'd said those exact things, you'd be like, oh, he had an anti-Semitic meltdown, But this is actually the way that they think about these things. And people like Larry Ellison are literally rich Jewish Zionists whose approach to the problems with Israel's legitimacy are, I'm just going to use all my money, buy all the media, and manipulate it so that people don't hear bad things, don't hear about the crimes that are being committed, including the mass slaughter of children. I mean, recall for how many times in recent years they would say, that's a blood libel. You're saying that we kill babies and eat them, right? Or whatever. And they would freak out about that. But you really can't libel them
or
at this
poison their
point.
wells. What
Yeah,
happens?
yeah. I mean,
and poison their wells. What
right.
actually happens?
Yeah. I mean, it's mind blowing. And Abby Martin was on Piers Morgan's show arguing with some, Zionist propagandist. And he was complaining about, oh, it's so terrible for you to say these things about us, and it's unfair. And she says, well, look, if you don't want to be compared to Nazis, stop doing Nazi shit. And it's a Nazified ideology. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's blood, it's genocide of the Untermenschen to get Lebensraum for the master race. What is this Gaza genocide if not that? It's the most brazen thing. It's not even hard to explain in terms of its general contours. So we have not been acting as rational imperialists, and I think that you have to look back at the deep history of the United States. And I have been focused on deep events like the Kennedy assassination and Watergate and Iran-Contra and 9/11 because they seem to come from this clandestine source of power, and they affect enormous shifts in political history, and they show some schisms in cleavages among the U.S. oligarchy. And in recent years, I've been fixated on George H.W. Bush, as weird as it sounds, because I am no fan of George H.W. Bush. But in May of 1989, one of the last things Ronald Reagan did as president was recognize the PLO over opposition from Zionist quarters, because they said, no, they're terrorists. You can't recognize them and negotiate with them because they're terrorists. Well, now it's obvious what their game was. They did not want there to be negotiations with the PLO, not because of a philosophical objection to terrorism, because Israel was established by terrorists. Okay, this is ridiculous. But if you call them terrorists, then you can say we don't negotiate with them, because Israel doesn't want to negotiate a Palestinian state, period. That's their obsession. The Zionists want greater Israel. And so to the point that if some Palestinians are in a room ready to negotiate with Israel will assassinate them just so they can avoid negotiations. I mean, it's literally that murderous and cynical. So in May of 1989, George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker, went in front of AIPAC, and he said, it is time, and this is only a couple months into the presidency, right? May of 1989. He says, it's time to put aside once and for all the unrealistic notion of greater Israel. And then H.W. Bush withheld loan guarantees, billions worth of loan guarantees, unless the Israelis would agree to the Madrid peace process. Okay. And I believe that this is why H.W. Bush lost that election. He believes that's why, according to people I know who know people that are friendly with the Bush family, that W. Bush changes and embraces Israel because he believed his father lost in 92 because he went against Israel. So W takes the opposite tack and he gets a second term. Whereas H.W. Bush got mired in scandal and national security scandals. There were just a whole lot of things that were leaked at that time. Like the Iran-Contra thing was still being dragged out, and they were trying to go after him for that. The exposure of BCCI, which is connected to Bush and the Saudis and the CIA networks that Bush was closer to, that was exposed by a super Zionist guy named Robert Morgenthau, whose father was one of the main actors that facilitated Israel acquiring the bomb, basically stealing the bomb from the U.S. That's who took down BCCI, which people understand that is a criminal CIA bank connected to the mob and so on, which it was. But the point was that Israel used its knowledge of the clandestine goings on of the U.S. to really blackmail the U.S. during that time. There's like a mini Watergate under H.W. Bush because he represented rational corporate kind of CFR, Wall Street, Standard Oil, waspy imperialism, and that they realized that the Zionists were actually dangerous to U.S. foreign policy. So when Wolfowitz wrote his crazy defense policy planning guidelines in like 1991 that called for preemptive war against anyone who might challenge U.S. hegemony, it was sort of like a clean break report or PNAC report, before they were ever written. People in Bush's administration leaked that to the press, and they caught H.W. Bush would call those people the crazies, the neocons, he called them the crazies. And when they wanted him to go all the way to Baghdad, in the Gulf War, he refused. He didn't want to destroy the regime and plunge the region into chaos, not because he was a good guy, but because he was a rational imperialist. So I think that what has happened in the 21st century is that we created this system of oligarchic pluralism and oligarchic sort of Game of Thrones struggles, that really the people who are the most unrelenting and single-minded and vicious and networked and tied into criminal networks, they can prevail. And that's really a criticism of this system. It's not to say, the problem is there are, Zionist Jews that are the real problem and they're conspiring against us. Is so we have a system that is so vicious and that rewards the most criminal elements, really, the people with the least scruples and most money at their disposal. That's who triumphs in American politics and in this sort of capitalist system. It's a vicious system. If you allow so much of the foundation of the economy to be in private hands and turned into avenues for rent seeking, then the people that get the most money and power are those who are the most vicious and single-minded about going after money and working with others and corrupting politics. And the corruption of politics and law enforcement in the 20th century was undertaken most spectacularly by the National Crime Syndicate, which was really headed by Meyer Lansky. Lucky Luciano was his partner, but Lansky eclipses him and takes it over. And he was never really investigated, except for a little window in early 1970 under Nixon. He went after the Vegas mob and Lansky a little bit, and Lansky had to flee to Israel. But that's the only, and he comes back, but then Nixon gets taken out in Watergate, which is connected to a lot of these same elements, but it would have exposed them. Ditto for Jack Ruby. Part of the reason they couldn't investigate Jack Ruby was because he tied into so much political corruption involving people in very high places that it would have been a disaster for U.S. legitimacy. It would have shown that he was protected by the heads of the FBI, that the crime syndicate was, Lansky in particular, but the whole National Crime Syndicate was protected by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics head, Harry Anslinger, and J. Edgar Hoover. And so they invented this Italian mafia myth. But that was like the retail level. There's a higher level. And the only time that this was written about in U.S. newspapers where they said, maybe there's more than this Italian mafia thing. There's some articles you can find from around 1970 where they start talking about organized crime. And I think that that's a big part of the story, the interface between the National Crime Syndicate and the command posts of the national security state and their essential protection. It was the fix. The fix was in, and I mean the fix, like we could call it the deep fix or the apex fix or whatever, but it allowed a kind of an institutionalization of criminal sovereignty in many areas in the United States. And out of that system emerged, after I think the defeat of H.W. Bush, really you had no one to challenge them, because Clinton seemed to be a blackmail thrall in some ways. The Lewinsky thing is very strange. He was controllable, and he had no real political base.
He's the most regular. We never hear that, but he was the most regular client on Epstein Island, almost. Why is nobody ever mentioning that?
Right, and this is some. I mean, since H.W. Bush, you haven't had anybody. Everybody was vetted by Israel, even. Barack Obama, Margaret Kimberly, she writes for Black Agenda Report, and does good work. She wrote an article maybe 2010 or something about Obama, and that he was endorsed by Henry Crown, Lester Crown, who's the son of Henry Crown. But that's a mobbed up family that traces back to connections to the murder of the wire service king back in like 1945 or 46, I think it was. And later to the TFX scandal that almost took Lyndon Johnson out, but then Lyndon Johnson gets rescued by the Kennedy assassination itself. I mean, these are Zionist oligarch families, and Obama was vetted by them in Chicago. And of course, he has those Rahm Emanuel connections. So I think you have to please these segments of the oligarchy if you're going to be in the presidency. And if not, you end up like Howard Dean, who they just sort of character assassinated and made a mockery of because of the control of the media in 2004, if you remember that. So it really is. It's oligarchic pluralism, and Zionists have been enormously successful at gaming the system. And if you want to read a book about it that doesn't address it in political terms, but it's really mind-blowing, it's The Money and the Power by Sally Denton and Roger Morris, and it's Las Vegas and the Making of Modern America. And I think it's so illuminating when you don't just look at like neoconservatism and Zionism, because even though she talks about all these guys' connections to Israel, she never really applies it to neoconservative foreign policy. It was written in the year 2000. It was published, right? But when you look back at these guys and you put it in the context of all the stuff that people like Peter Dale Scott write about, it's pregnant with implication. Additionally, they took that Lansky model of how to make money, in casinos. The Lansky observation about American capitalism kind of comes from him watching gambling games. And he was saying, you can play craps and you can try to be a good gambler, but really the position you want to be in is the guy that runs the game. The guy that runs the craps game, the guy that runs the poker game, because he always wins. He's rigged it, and he's bribed the cops. That's the business model, and that in microcosm is how they set up the crime syndicate. Corrupting law enforcement, owning the game, owning the casino. You profit no matter what. You sell the drugs. You launder that money through gambling enterprises because there's so much heavy cash, flow into those, and then you just expand your operations nationally by accommodating people when you have to, killing them if you have to. And then now you apply that to the economy and you kind of get neoliberal casino capitalism. And that seems to have coincided with an explosion of the wealth of Zionist Americans, because I don't think in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was like this, where every independent institution, like every independent school, every university is like, oh gosh, we can't criticize Israel at all because we'll lose all of our donors that we depend on to be able to function. It's like something happened to transform the economy. It's partly this casino capitalism. And when you look at casinos in Vegas and Lansky and crime, then you start to understand how the darkest elements and coalitions end up taking control of this system. Because if you're not the most evil, vicious person, you'll just get killed or otherwise defeated by someone who is willing to use any and all means to win on the field of play, which is, capitalist money making and political corruption, to make sure you win. And so that seems to be what has happened to the U.S. But the problem is that this makes you a fucked up society that we can't function in terms of creating the best scientists, having the healthiest population. We put our population under all sorts of pressure. So how many brilliant minds who could have come up with things that would help humanity are wasted because they have difficult childhoods. They have material insecurity. Maybe their family has all this strife in part because of the material and cultural problems of the United States. So, or if they are smart, they end up doing things like, oh, I'm going to design financial derivatives, or I'm going to do other, basically things that are anti-social, anti-human. Ultimately, I'm going to make AI, so that we can like have a way to get rid of all these workers and manage their opinions, and create bots to like do stupid shit on the internet or whatever they're doing with all their time. This is the logic of it, and it's a dysfunctional society that really can't compete anymore. We can't compete on a fair playing field, and we're not powerful enough to rig the game so that we never have to compete on a fair playing field anymore. And now we just look like a corrupt empire in terminal decline. We seem like something from a movie. We seem like something from Idiocracy or the Hunger Games. I mean, these are the only references we have, because it's just so counter to the myths.
Oligarchic pluralism. I love it. I think that's very well said. Maybe it's oligarchic pluralism meets battle royale in the sense that like the nastiest, worst killer can rise to the top. But yeah,
Yeah,
well said.
yeah. And also, I think, and not just the United States. I think the Zionist stranglehold is semi-global, at least in Europe and Latin America, parts of Asia as well. And it's indeed when you talk about that, Aaron, it also explains the absolute unwillingness and the total fear among our political classes, whether it's in the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, UK, France, Germany. I mean, if these guys run every bloody platform, and now they even took over TikTok. I mean, the only counter narrative a bit to empire that originated in China is also taken over by the Zionists. I mean, you can be any politician you want anywhere. The moment you start to become a little bit too difficult, they can literally see everything of you. They can go into your Gmail, your PMs in TikTok, Facebook, Google, your searches, your medical records, everything you did in the past, your diaries, so to speak. I mean, there is almost that is so incredibly scary, I think, also for a lot of these political figures, that they don't even want to try, and they are not scared, or these people do not, how do you say it? They do not hold back. They will literally blackmail you with anything they have. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but they're more out and they're more exposed in the open now, and I think that this is not really how they are operating. I think that the fact that it's so visible now is not as much a function of their omnipotence as their weakness and their vulnerability. I think that it's more precarious because the basis, the dollar system, dollar hegemony is crumbling. The military, I don't believe that we have the best fighting force anymore. I don't think we could really seriously mount a long invasion campaign, an occupation of any major country anymore. We might be able to destroy some countries and we can blow up the world, but it's actually the cancerous behavior of these individuals, the sort of cancerous dynamics of late empire, especially one wedded to an insane, fascistic, not Nazified cause, really, is it's dialectically generating its own nemesis, and that's what happens to empires. This is what happens to empires, and the Chinese have a better understanding of this in the bigger sense than we do, because they have the dynastic cycle, which involves so much corruption from having had access to the levers of power for so long that the regime creates all of these problems because they are too greedy, and they end up harming the people, and it creates social chaos and problems, and eventually sweep away the dynasty. And we don't have the kind of it's not in our cultural DNA to think of power in this way. We're more liberals in the bigger sense of how we think of these things, and then we think that we're really special and exceptional. And I think that when you see it now, we're a society that is rather rigid and inflexible, and totally adherent to oligarchy and empire in ways that filter down to every layer of our thinking, at least in terms of what's accepted by institutions and the prevailing political order. So it's difficult for us to reverse course, but I think that one way or another, the course will be reversed, because I think that we are headed for some kind of defeat or retrenchment, one way or another.
Well, yeah, I think that's very likely to happen. I mean, it's almost guaranteed to happen given the ecological crisis we're speeding towards. But hopefully we have a resolution that's not as disastrous as that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. It was great talking with you. Any recommendations to listeners or viewers to check out some of your work?
Yeah, the best place to find my work is the American Exception podcast on Patreon. So it's American Exception, Patreon/American Exception, I think is what it is. I should be able to roll that off better, but I'm not at the best. I actually don't like being in the space of having to promote myself all the time. But what other choice do you have if you're too radical for the academy? So that's where I am.
You're not going to win the oligarchic pluralist battle royale.
Yeah, right. I'm not the champion there.
Man. The capitalist game.
So, but I appreciate you guys giving me a platform here and talking about these things. I do feel that the only real democracy that we have, and the most important thing that we can be doing, is just trying to speak about these things candidly and pointing to things that are hopeful when it's rational, but also being realistic about the situation. I think that we're heading for something good for the world, which is the end of Western global dominance. It's sort of it's a necessary but insufficient thing to bring us to a better situation for all of humanity. And my hope is that they will realize that any gambit that they may attempt to pursue is just going to make it worse, and that and that they can be deterred somehow, and that they may want to reform things because they have no other choice, and not because they have a change of heart, but because they realize there's no other choice. And that if suddenly if you start talking about the truth of our own history and you put it in its historical context, maybe there can be a way of sort of truth and reconciliation, and a understanding that it's really a civilizational thing rather than looking for so much vengeance on particular criminals who deserve it. But let's be honest. But in the interests of like humanity and going forward, if we can wrest power from these sources somehow without bringing on nuclear doomsday, that's the task we should dedicate ourselves to, because it really is pressing, and we got to somehow create the solidarity needed to do that. And so to be a part of any discussions to that end, that's what I'd hope to do. And I think that what you guys are doing is part of that as well.
Thank you, man, and definitely same here. And I also wanted to quickly say that your discussion, indeed, with the Turkish lady on 9/11 and all these kind of intricacies, yes, excellent. People really need to go and listen to that. So people often have the tendency to click away when they don't see an image. People speaking. In this case, it's more of an audio show, right? You don't have. It's like a radio show.
Yeah,
podcast. Yeah. But seriously, to all our viewers, check it out. It's on American Exception podcast on YouTube. Listen to it. It's super good. And it really opens your eyes to that deep criminality behind 9/11 and all these kind of events. So I quickly wanted to say that. Thanks for coming on again. We have other shows with Aaron, so you guys can also go back into our videos list to see other great conversations. We keep following you, and until next time.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. And at some point, you guys can come on American Exception. We'll record a show. So
sounds good.
Yeah,
great.
Thank you.
All right.
Before you go, Aaron, when you click away, please leave it on so it can upload. Yeah, I always say it to guests, otherwise I have to email you. Okay,
no problem.
Cool.
Hey, I'll send you guys we're looking to get like endorsements, blurbs, I guess, for the film. So I'll send you guys the documentaries, and you guys can check. If you get the time, you can watch them. There's 3 parts, about an hour long each. So yes. I think that you'll appreciate them. So I'll let you guys just don't forward them to people.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Awesome. Till next time.
All right.
Okay. Peace.
All right. See ya. Bye.
حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي انا حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي تكتيكي تكتيكي